Stop. Before we talk about markets, before we talk about Bitcoin, before we talk about Michael Saylor, I need you to remember something. Remember the moment you saw that headline. Where were you? What were you doing? Because I am willing to bet you were not calmly analyzing charts. You were on your phone. And when those words appeared, Michael Saylor sold Bitcoin, something happened inside you. Before you finished reading, before you knew the amount, before you had a single fact, something tightened. A small alarm, a quiet but unmistakable signal that said, "Pay attention. Something might be wrong." And then you read the number. 32. Not 3,200, not 32,000. 32 Bitcoin. From a man who holds hundreds of thousands. From a man who built his entire public identity around never selling. 32. And you still felt it. That is the story. Not the sale. What happened inside you before you knew what to think about it. That moment, that fraction of a second where the alarm fired before the analysis arrived, tells you everything about how markets actually work, and everything about what is secretly driving your trading decisions every single day. This video is not about Michael Saylor. It is about that moment. Your moment. Let's go deep. Here is something most trading education will never tell you. You do not trade markets. You trade your interpretation of markets. And your interpretation is never neutral. It is filtered through everything you believe, everything you fear, everyone you trust, every story you have been told about what certain events mean. When you see a green candle, you do not just see a candle. You feel something. Optimism, relief, the quiet satisfaction of being right. When you see a red candle after a strong uptrend, you do not just see a candle. You feel something else. Doubt. The beginning of a question. Should I still be here? Now multiply that by a headline. A headline is not just information. It's an emotional event. It arrives with context, with history, with all the weight of everything you associate with the person or asset it describes. And Michael Saylor arrives with an enormous amount of weight. Years of it. Because for years, that man did something that very few public figures do. He committed. Completely. Publicly. Without reservation. He staked his reputation, his company's future, his personal credibility on a single idea. Bitcoin is the most important asset in human history, and I will never sell. And he held. Through crashes, through skepticism, through every moment that would have given lesser conviction an excuse to retreat. He held. And holding, in a world of people who constantly change their minds, became a symbol, a signal, a psychological anchor for every person watching who wanted to believe the thesis, but needed someone braver than themselves to demonstrate that believing was safe. That anchor mattered more than most people realized. Until it moved. The brain does not process information the way you think it does. You believe you read a headline, consider the facts, assess the implications, and then feel something. That is not what happens. The amygdala processes emotional significance faster than the prefrontal cortex processes rational content. By the time you have consciously registered what the headline says, your nervous system has already run a threat assessment. And in the case of the Saylor headline, the threat assessment fired immediately. Because the brain had been tracking Michael Saylor as an authority figure, not consciously, automatically. The way it tracks every authority figure in every environment. The experienced colleague whose behavior signals when something is wrong. The doctor whose expression tells you before they speak whether the news is good.
The market veteran whose composure shifts fractionally when something unusual is happening. The brain watches these people constantly because in evolutionary terms, authority figures have better information. They have survived longer. They have seen more. Their behavioral signals are worth prioritizing. And when those signals change unexpectedly, when the authority figure who never sells, the threat assessment fires before a single rational thought arrives. Something is different. Pay attention. Protect yourself. That is not weakness. That is 100,000 years of survival programming running in a fraction of a second. The problem is not that the alarm fired. The problem is what most traders did next. They acted on the alarm, without asking whether the alarm was justified, without checking the amount, without listing alternative explanations, without pausing long enough for the rational brain to catch up to the emotional one. They acted because the feeling felt like information. It felt so certain, so urgent, so obviously correct. But feelings in markets are not information. They are reactions to information. And reactions are almost always disproportionate, especially when authority figures are involved.
There is a distinction that will change how you read every market-moving headline for the rest of your trading career. The distinction between information and interpretation. They feel identical in the moment. They are not. Information is what happened. Michael Saylor sold 32 Bitcoin. That is the information. Factual, verifiable, complete. Interpretation is what you conclude from what happened. He is losing conviction. The thesis is changing. Something is wrong. I should reduce exposure. None of those are information. Every single one of them is a conclusion you constructed from uncertainty, from imagination, from the threat amplification system that generates worst-case scenarios when authority figure behavior disrupts familiar patterns. And here is the brutal truth about the gap between information and interpretation. The market priced the interpretation, not the information. Within minutes of the headline, price moved. Not because 32 Bitcoin changed the supply picture, because the interpretation spread. Person to person, channel to channel, fear to fear, until the interpretation felt like consensus, until the conclusion that had been constructed from imagination felt like established fact, until people were making financial decisions based on a story they had told themselves from an event that, stripped of its narrative weight, was completely inconsequential. That is how markets work. Not the version in the textbooks, the version that actually costs and makes money every single day. The version where story beats data, where feeling beats analysis, where the crowd's interpretation of an event matters more than the event itself. And once you see this clearly, once you can feel it happening in real time and name it before it controls you, you stop being part of the crowd reacting to the headline. You become the person watching the crowd react. And those are very different positions to be in. Very different financially. Very different psychologically. Very different in terms of where you end up at the end of a career in this market. Here is the part nobody in those panicked group chats was discussing. While traders were debating what the sale meant, while the crowd was collectively constructing catastrophic interpretations from a rounding error, some people were doing something completely different. They were watching the reaction, not joining it, watching it. Because they understood something that the panicking crowd did not. The reaction is the data, not the sale. The sale is 32 Bitcoin, irrelevant. But the reaction? The reaction tells you everything about where the crowd is sitting. Think about it like this. If the crowd's conviction was deep, if the people holding Bitcoin had built their positions on genuine understanding of the thesis, 32 coins from one holder would produce nothing. A shrug, a brief note, maybe a mildly curious conversation, and then silence. Back to the charts. But that is not what happened. What happened was disproportionate, massively disproportionate. And disproportionate reactions to small events are the market's way of showing you something it cannot say directly. The confidence is fragile, the conviction is borrowed,
The crowd is closer to the edge than the price suggests. And fragile confidence, borrowed conviction, and crowds near the edge do not stay where they are indefinitely. They either get a reason to stabilize or they get a reason to fall. And the professional watching that reaction was not asking what the 32 Bitcoin meant about the thesis. They were asking what the reaction to 32 Bitcoin meant about the crowd, and they were positioning accordingly. There is a distinction that will change how you read every market-moving headline for the rest of your trading career. The distinction between information and interpretation. They feel identical in the moment. They are not. Information is what happened. Michael Saylor sold 32 Bitcoin. That is the information. Factual, verifiable, complete. Interpretation is what you conclude from what happened. He is losing conviction. The thesis is changing. Something is wrong. I should reduce exposure. None of those are information. Every single one of them is a conclusion you constructed from uncertainty, from imagination, from the threat amplification system that generates worst-case scenarios when authority figure behavior disrupts familiar patterns. And here is the brutal truth about the gap between information and interpretation. The market priced the interpretation, not the information. Within minutes of the headline, price moved, not because 32 Bitcoin changed the supply picture, because the interpretation spread, person to person, channel to channel, fear to fear, until the interpretation felt like consensus, until the conclusion that had been constructed from imagination felt like established fact, until people were making financial decisions based on a story they had told themselves from an event that, stripped of its narrative weight, was completely inconsequential. That is how markets work. Not the version in the textbooks, the version that actually costs and makes money every single day. The version where story beats data, where feeling beats analysis, where the crowd's interpretation of an event matters more than the event itself. And once you see this clearly, once you can feel it happening in real time and name it before it controls you, you stop being part of the crowd reacting to the headline. You become the person watching the crowd react. And those are very different positions to be in, very different financially, very different psychologically, very different in terms of where you end up at the end of a career in this market. So what do you actually do with this, right now, practically? Because understanding it intellectually is one thing. Using it when the next headline arrives, when the next alarm fires before the analysis has a chance to catch up, is another thing entirely. The first thing you do is give the alarm permission to exist without acting on it. Notice it. Name it. I am feeling the threat response because an authority figure did something unexpected. That single act of naming creates space between the feeling and the decision. Not a lot of space. Enough. Then you go to the number. Always the number, because the number is almost always more revealing than the story. How much? Relative to what? In what context? 32 Bitcoin from a holder of hundreds of thousands is not a signal. It is barely a footnote. If the number is small and the reaction is large, you have found something. Not a directional trade, a psychological reading. A map of where the crowd's confidence actually is, and that map is more valuable than any price target. Then you wait. Not because waiting is passive, because waiting is the discipline that keeps you out of the emotional trade and available for the rational one. The emotional trade happens in the first 30 minutes after a headline like this. The rational trade happens after the emotion exhausts itself, after the crowd has made the disproportionate move, after the gap between what the story priced and what the reality supports becomes visible. That gap is where the edge is, but you can only see it if you did not spend the first 30 minutes moving with everyone else. And finally, keep a record. Every time a major narrative event disrupts the market, document 3 things. What the actual event was, how large the emotional reaction was relative to the actual event, and what price did after the emotional wave subsided. Over time, that record becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a framework, and the framework becomes the most valuable tool you have for navigating markets that move on stories rather than facts, which is most markets, most of the time. Michael Saylor sold 32 Bitcoin. And somewhere, in a Discord channel, in a group chat, at a trading desk, at a screen in a quiet room, someone felt something before they knew what to think. Maybe that was you. Maybe you felt the alarm. Maybe you felt the tightening. Maybe you opened Twitter before you checked the chart. Maybe you spent 20 minutes reading takes on what it meant before you sat down to think about what it actually was. If that was you, good. Not because you were wrong to feel it, because you felt it and you noticed that you felt it. And noticing is the beginning of everything. The traders who stay in this game the longest are not the ones who never feel the alarm. They all feel it, every single one. The amygdala does not care how experienced you are. It fires the same way for everyone. What changes with experience is not the feeling, it is the relationship with the feeling. The ability to observe it without becoming it. To feel the tightening and ask, what is this trying to tell me, and is it actually right? To hear the alarm and pause for 30 seconds, for 30 minutes, before deciding whether to act on it. To watch the crowd react and ask, what does the size of this reaction tell me about where the crowd actually is? That pause, that question, that capacity to feel the alarm and not immediately reach for the exit, that is the skill. Not the analysis, not the strategy, not the indicator or the system or the edge. The pause. Because in the pause, you go from being part of the crowd to being someone who studies it. From reacting to the story to understanding the story. From 32 Bitcoin feeling like a catastrophe to 32 Bitcoin revealing exactly where the opportunity is forming. The market was reacting to belief, and belief reveals itself most clearly in moments of disruption. Watch for those moments. Study them. Let the crowd move first, then ask where they are going and whether reality is going with them. It rarely is. Your growth as a trader begins with self-awareness. The rest follows. I'll see you in the next video.